Let's discuss with Congressman Adam Kinzinger. He's an Illinois Republican. He's joining us now live. Congressman, thanks so much for joining us. And I want our viewers to know you served in the U.S. military in Iraq and Afghanistan. You're still a very active member of the Air National Guard. I understand you were just deployed last week. But do you agree with people, for example, like Republican Senator Tom Cotton, who says the military should be put in the streets at this delicate moment?
No, I don't. And, the military wasn't put in the street when it's the National Guard. So the National Guard's role, and I think the National Guard is largely misunderstood in this conversation. Their job right now is to augment and reinforce law enforcement. Anything the National Guard does is at the direction of law enforcement. Active duty military, that I think is something that should only be on the table if there's a threat of an overthrow of the government. If a governor, for instance, says, I don't have enough forces to be able to do what needs to be done, not just unilaterally the federal government putting these troops in, short of, again, a real threat to a state or to a federal survival.
Yeah, that's what the 1807 Insurrection Act is all about. If there's an insurrection, if there's a real threat to the United States government. What's your reaction, though, Congressman, to the CNN reporting that at one point the president actually wanted 10,000 active duty troops deployed to the streets of D.C. To quell all the protests, including some of the violence that was going on?
Yeah, well, I'm glad it didn't happen. It seemed like the system of, the Secretary of Defense and advisors worked. They did suggest let's use the National Guard, which is appropriate, by the way. You have to think of where we were at that moment. I mean, we had pharmacies basically being looted, stores being destroyed and burned. There was a charge against the White House where you had to have Secret Service repel that. And I think there was a lot of concern. But there's no doubt that 10,000 federal troops wouldn't have been the right answer on that. But I do think the National Guard was. Any place we've seen where the National Guard, by the way, it's not a partisan thing because mostly Democratic governors have called in the National Guard in their states. Where the National Guard has come in, there's been calm. Is it intimidating to see MRAPs and men in BDUs? Yeah. That's kind of the point, though. It's meant to be a distraction from, robbing and looting stores and allowing for space for peaceful protests.
As you know, in recent days, a group of former defense officials have openly criticized the president's response to the protests. We're talking about James Mattis, John Kelly, Mike Mullen, among many others. Do you basically agree with their points of view?
Well, not necessarily. Look, I think the president says a lot of stuff he shouldn't say. I wish Twitter didn't exist, first off, at all, but I certainly wish he didn't have a Twitter account. But I think, I read this letter today where the defense officials were saying that, the president said he wants all the governors to basically squash the protests. The president hasn't said that. At least I haven't heard him say there shouldn't be protests. Where his concern is, where mine is too, and frankly where every American should be as well, is the violence that I think detracted from the very beautiful message of, this is something as a nation we have to pay attention to. So, I think it's kind of for some of these the straw that broke the camel's back because, it's been 3.5 years of tweets that some of us get tired of. But I don't necessarily agree with them and their final conclusion on that.
As you know, House Democrats will unveil several sweeping police reform legislation details. You've seen some of those details already emerging. Is this something you think you could support?
Well, the devil's totally in the details on this. If it's training, training about how to treat people equally better, screening of police officers to see if there's an issue there. That's something, in theory, I could get on. If it's defunding the police, like I've been hearing, no, absolutely not. I mean, that's a short sight, and I don't think anybody's actually taking that seriously. But
that by the way, defunding the police is not in that reform bill.
Yeah, good. And so we'll have to take a look at what it is. If it's a political document that's being put in front of us and not a serious attempt, I'll be sad because I think we have a real moment here. And this is what the protests have shown us. Is there's all this talk about systemic racism in the country. The reality is I'm seeing a lot of young white people out on the street saying we've had enough of this. And I think that's a good thing. That's something we ought to celebrate, that this country is recognizing an issue and we're going to stand up and deal with it.
But do you agree there is systemic racism, at least among some police departments?
I think, well, yeah, I'm sure, yes, among some police departments. But when you talk about systemic, it means that it's basically, as what I understand it, baked into laws. It's baked into, treating people differently in courts. To the extent that that happens, sure. But I think we have to celebrate the fact that this country has come a very long way, even though we have more to go. Because once I think we start fighting and getting in our corners, no reform is going to be made. And that's what my concern is. Look, as a white man, I have to understand that, black, especially young black men, when they walk on the street, they have a fear that I've never felt before. And I think if we can all see the world through each other's eyes, we can come further in this.
Congressman Adam Kinzinger of Illinois, as usual, thanks so much for joining us.
Of course.